Okay, so our next unit on congruent triangles. There's a few things you got to be able to recognize to prove triangles congruent. So there's basically 5 different ways to justify whether 2 triangles are congruent. The first one is when we have all of the sides congruent. So this first example here, we'll call this example 1. We have this side congruent to that side on these 2 triangles. This is congruent to that. And my third side is congruent to my third side. This is known as side, side, side. So basically, if all 3 sides are congruent, the triangles are congruent. Let's try another method. If you notice here, I have marked this side congruent to that side, this side congruent to that side, and then I have this angle in between them marked congruent. This is called an included angle. It's called that because it is included in between the 2 sides. It's kind of sandwiched in between them. I have a side, an angle, and a side. The angle's not out here. It's not side, side, angle, or so if you do it kind of in a clockwise direction, side, angle, side, it's in between the 2 sides. And this is known as side, angle, side, SAS, side, angle, side, where I have a side congruent to a side, the included angle, and then the other side congruent. Then I have this example where I have an angle congruent to the second triangle. I have this angle congruent here to that second triangle, and then I have this side congruent here. So notice that this one, the side is not included. It's not angle, side, angle. That would mean it was included. It'd be included in between these 2 sides. Instead, if you go kind of again in a counter or in a clockwise motion, angle, angle, side, it's not included. But this is another method to prove angles congruent, known as angle, angle, side. And typically, instead of writing them out, and I should be writing these out for you, angle, angle, side, we just use AAS, or this one, side, angle, side, or side, side, side. So in a proof, you don't need to write out angle, side, angle. You can write AAS. All right, here's our another example. This time what I have is I have an angle congruent there. I have a side, and then I have another angle. So like the one before it, I have 2 angles, but this time the side is included. The side is in between. I have angle. If I go clockwise, angle, side, angle. This is known as angle, side, angle. And again, it is different than the previous one. It is included. All right, our last one we have for proving triangles congruent is when you have a right triangle. So it has to be a right triangle, which means it should be marked as a right triangle. And the hypotenuse is congruent. Remember, the hypotenuse is the side opposite the right angle, and one of the legs is congruent. And this is known as hypotenuse leg. Okay, so now when you're doing this, sometimes they're not completely separate triangles like what we just saw. Sometimes it's something like this. So for example, on something like this, maybe you have those sides congruent and those sides congruent. But that's not enough. I don't just have a side-side method of proving triangles congruent. But these triangles are congruent, and here's why. Because this is actually side, angle, side. Can you see why it is side, angle, side? Hopefully you can see that there is a vertical angle right here, right? Vertical angles are congruent. So on things like this, you have to look for those other things we know about, like linear pairs and vertical angles and parallel lines. You've got to be looking for those things because it's not going to be marked that way because it's expected that you will recognize this as a vertical angle, and then you can say, oh, side, angle, side, it's congruent. These triangles are congruent. You might also get something like this, where these are marked parallel to each other. And so maybe on this one, let's see, maybe I've got something like this is congruent to this, and maybe I've got, well, maybe that's all I've got. Maybe that's the only thing I'm given for this one. But you have to be able to recognize that because these are pairs, this is a transversal, which means that this is an alternate, these two are alternate interior angles, and they are congruent. And these are alternate interior angles, and they are congruent. And then what you end up with is angle, angle, side. So this one is angle, angle, side. And again, the only thing that you might be given on this one was this, these green. And you have to recognize, and you'd be given this, the fact that they are parallel. And you have to recognize, okay, I can mark these congruent because they are alternate interior angles. So same thing up here. The only thing we were given up here was that those were congruent and those were congruent, and you had to recognize that there were vertical angles. So let's look at this one down here. I might be given something like this is congruent to this, and this is congruent to that. Well, these are also congruent. And they are congruent by side, 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 because this is a shared side. Both triangles have that side. A line segment is congruent to itself, so I can actually mark this. It is congruent to itself. And now I have side, angle, side, 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 side. I have all three sides congruent. So again, on this one, the only thing you were given would have been maybe this, and you have to recognize this. So let's look at the things you had to recognize. You had to recognize the vertical angles here. You had to recognize on this one alternate interior angles, and on this one you had to recognize that a side is congruent to itself. So let's take a look at one more. You also might be told something like this. You might be told B is a midpoint of AC. You have to know that a midpoint means I can mark this congruent to this. And then maybe on this, and then you've got vertical angles here, so you can mark those vertical angles congruent. And then maybe on this one you were told that this was parallel to that, which means you also have alternate interior angles. And these are also alternate interior angles. So you can actually do this one. You could do it multiple ways. You could do it angle, side. You could do angle, angle, side. But notice that the only thing given to you on this one was that you were given that these were parallel, and you were given B as a midpoint. And the rest of it was markings that you recognized from vertical angle. These are parallel. This is a transversal, alternate interior, transversal, alternate interior. And the definition of a midpoint means that's congruent to that. So there's a lot you're going to have to look at these and recognize on your own as you're proving them. So quick review. We have side, side, side. So you're looking at all three sides in one triangle are congruent to the three sides of the other ones, the corresponding sides. Side, angle, side. You've got two sides and the included angle. Angle, angle, side. You have two angles and the side is not included. Angle, side, angle. Two angles and an included side. And then you've got hypotenuse leg, which is the hypotenuse in one of the legs. And again, the rest of it, you're going to need to be recognizing vertical angles and marking them, alternate interior angles, shared sides, and midpoints.